Museum, and I want to thank the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada for their partnership in this series and helping out with getting some of the speakers. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically the Adirondack and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as treaty lands and territory with Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Haldimand Tract and is part of a long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Gillian. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. Her research looks at Canadian correspondence at both the heart and margins of the Second World War, connecting home front and battlefront and examining the meaning of letters and how they get from one point to another. Through this work, she aims to make the exploration of history more accessible through digital methods, storytelling, and hands-on engagement with the past. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. And yes, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I think, honestly, I like the size of this crowd as well. I think this will be good, especially during question period. I'm excited to talk to you all about the research that I do. And so my presentation title is From Sherbrooke with Love, Illicit Correspondence, Civilian Internment in Canada in the Second World War. And so this presentation is based on my master's research, which in part got me interested in looking at wartime correspondence more generally. The kind of core of my master's work was based around a court-martial case involving Corporal Bernard Henson of the Veterans Guard of Canada, who was caught and charged under Section 40 of the Army Act, which is conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. So I'm going to get into that, the circumstances of that case, as well as the events leading up to it, and then get a little bit more into thinking about letters and their afterlives as well. Clicker. This presentation is going to kind of take place in three parts. The first one is going to look at the development and use of the Canadian internment system during the Second World War. Then I'm going to go into the social dynamics within these camps. And then, again, the afterlives will be the third part, expected and otherwise, of wartime stories and sources. So, to begin, setting the scene of this tale. So at the outbreak of the war in 1939, more than 74,000 people of German and Austrian origin lived in the UK. Many were refugees from Europe, fleeing the rising tide of the Third Reich. War hysteria led to paranoia about the loyalties of these new arrivals, and the British Home Office set up refugee tribunals in an attempt to organize their increased population. Refugees were organized into three main categories. Category A were deemed suspect and interned immediately. Category B were at liberty with restrictions. They couldn't go out at certain times of the night. They weren't allowed to ride bicycles, different kind of transit related restrictions. And then Category C were exempt from internment. In May of 1940, however, Hitler invades Belgium and the Netherlands, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls for the immediate internment of all male German and Austrian nationals between 16 and 60 in this coastal belt here along the UK. So that's from Inverness down to Dorset. This is over fears of invasion, and we'll see in a little bit what that might look like. But this area includes the University of Cambridge, the London School of Economics, and any unlucky vacationers who happen to be along the British coast at this time. So that's around 2,000 men. The Dunkirk evacuation, shortly afterward, put fears of Nazi invasion on British soil at an all-time high. The Home Office, again, was concerned with the material costs of housing all of these internees, but also afraid that foreign subversives might help enemy parachutists invade in the event of a bombardment, which was seen as imminent. And so they decided to send the civilian internees to Canada. So I just have a newspaper article from the Times Colonist in Victoria, BC, just with a picture of these internees being rounded up. So the initial request to send internees from the UK to Canada was rejected by Ottawa. Though Canada had a policy of internment under the 1939 Defence of Canada regulations and a history of internment, civilian internment in the First World War, there was some hesitancy to accept potential threats into the country. Eventually, the agreement was reached to accept 7,000 dangerous German prisoners. Britain would cover the cost of transportation and a mix of Category A civilians, again, those deemed suspect, and prisoners of war would be sent over to Canada. The British Home Office, however, was unable to provide such large numbers of prisoners and decided that extra spaces would be filled instead by Category B and C civilians. And so I have here a map of the internment camps in Canada during the Second World War. So the Canadian government set up about 28 temporary camps throughout the country. They were constructed in New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec, and also in Alberta and British Columbia over here. But the majority of them were down in southern Ontario and Quebec. The camps were largely operated by members of the Veterans Guard of Canada, known as the VGC. They worked alongside the Provost Corps, or the military police, and were First World War veterans who had re-enlisted in the Second World War, but were deemed too old for overseas service, or at least at this time too old for overseas active service. In 1940, the maximum age for Veterans Guardsmen was 50, but this gradually went up as the war progressed, and the need for manpower rose. They were seen as good candidates for holding the ramparts of Canada. One recruitment ad said that the VGC would be able to handle the monotony of the duties, the unceasing vigilance, and the strictness of discipline required by the job of guarding Canada. They're essentially our dad's army. They're the home guard here in Canada. This is an aside, really. They're a great group to look at because they really represent to such a wide range of middle-aged Canadian men at the time, if you're interested in looking at them, and a lot of again variety in their life experiences as First World War vets. So that's the context for our story. Then we go into Winky and the Musketeers. So on the hot summer morning of July 13th, 1940, the Ettrick, a decommissioned British ocean liner, sailed down the St. Lawrence toward the port at Quebec City. This is a picture of the Ettrick pre-1940. So the ship was filled with hundreds of men who now came up onto the decks, blinking in the sunlight after a 11-day journey across the Atlantic that had been plagued by seasickness and attempts at U-boat attacks. These men had been funneled within the UK through Liverpool to the Isle of Man and finally to Canada. From there, they had boarded 2 ships to Canada. The Ettrick was one. The other one was the Arendora Star, which was actually sunk on the way across, and many of the internees drowned on that. So this is the surviving ship that made it across the Atlantic. On board, the holds were full of machine guns and barbed wire, and again characterized by overcrowding and seasickness. This was the first cohort of civilian internees and POWs sent to Canada in the summer of 1940. They were greeted by crowds of curious onlookers who viewed them with suspicion, as rumors had persisted of dangerous enemy aliens being shipped from the UK to Canada. So from the Ettrick, internees were escorted to the outskirts. These internees were escorted to the outskirts of Quebec City by military motorcade. There they had their meager belongings searched and in cases stolen. And from there, they were taken to Camp L at Cove Fields. So if you're familiar with Quebec City, this is on the Plains of Abraham near the Quebec Citadel. It was a converted military barracks that had just been built for soldiers being sent overseas. Now they've used it for these internees. Located close to the city, close enough that civilians could walk down and walk along the edge of the enclosure as well. I actually just met a fellow this morning who remembered this camp in Quebec City when he was a kid, and he remembered his family going for a drive to look at the internees in this camp, and he said it did not seem like the fence around them would hold anything. It was just like a single fence, so very, very limited fortifications around that space. And there's a good reason for that. So within the first 2 weeks in Canada, the truth about the new arrivals was found out. So while some Nazi sympathizers and prisoners of war had arrived on that shipment of men, others were high school students, university professors, rabbis, and priests. The wholesale internment kind of scheme in the UK had sent over anti-Nazi refugees alongside the dangerous enemy aliens that they had described in their initial agreement, which led to bureaucratic nightmares. British officials would have to come back over to Canada now to conduct interviews to determine who was a legitimate refugee and who was an actual enemy alien. So all of this is happening, swirling around, and again in kind of the heart of Quebec City at this moment. So among those who traveled aboard the Ettrick were 3 young Category C civilians. Images here. Not all of these are from the time period. The one of Jerry, that's a little bit later, but these are about accurate of how they would have looked. So we have Ernst Peter Guter, who is a 23-year-old Polish man who lived in Berlin but came to England to study social work and economics at the University of Southampton. Fred Lysette in the middle, who was 21 years old at the time. He was born in Berlin to an English father and German mother and grew up near Wimbledon with his mother and stepfather and attended college for training as an engineer. And then Jerry at the end, Jerry Arnhold, 22 years old, the son of a well-known banker in Dresden and who was enrolled at King's College at Cambridge University. Peter, well, he goes by Peter, Ernst and Jerry are both Jewish, but Fred is not. Fred also doesn't speak German. He never really lived in Germany beyond being born in Berlin, but because of his background, he's still considered a potential enemy alien, and that's why he gets rounded up with the rest of them as well. Oh, actually, I'll go back for a second. So Fred, Ernst, and Jerry meet through the compulsory employment scheme in Camp L. This is meant to keep the camps self-sufficient and allowed for prisoners to kind of take a sense of ownership in their internment. It was meant to boost prisoner morale, give them purpose, and avoid insubordination. So Fred was assigned to run the boiler house at Camp L, and the others worked alongside him, where they would spend long nights around the fire, stealing coffee from the canteen, and cigarettes, getting cigarettes from doing other internees' laundry, and just generally spending long hours in conversation around the fire. Here is also where they met Corporal Bernard Henson, a VGC member assigned to supervise their work in the boiler house. So Henson was a First World War veteran who had served with the Canadian Army Service Corps in the First World War as a driver and chauffeur. 50 years old, he had come to Canada as a British home child around 1913 and now lived with his wife and 8 children in Little Burgundy, a working class neighborhood in Montreal. This is not an up-to-date photo of him at the time. This is definitely circa the First World War. So, fraternization was strictly forbidden between camp personnel and internees, but it was not uncommon in practice, as happens right when you're sharing a space with other people. So they shared cigarettes, occasionally exchanged art and souvenirs, and occasionally smuggled in alcohol as well, which is, I think, one of the ways that Barney befriended the young men, the musketeers. The Veterans Guard and internees lived a common life. They ate the same food, they suffered from the same weather, and they slept in similar crowded barracks. They also dealt with the common problem of internitis, which was described as a combination of despondency, touchiness, and self-pity brought on by long periods of uncertainty and stagnation, which, as you can imagine, pretty prevalent in these sorts of situations. So, internees and guards alike engaged in a range of strategies to pass the time and combat internitis. As historian Paula Draper described them, the civilian internment camps of the early years of the war were like little male cities, replete with cafes, sporting areas, schools, workshops, and places of worship. They produced art, staged musicals, played sports, read books, produced camp newspapers, and in that, I mean, there's one excerpt that always stands out in my mind where they send a letter to Ginger Rogers asking her if she'd like to come visit them at the camp as well, which she did not respond to as far as I know. But they're doing all of these different things in order to kind of deal with boredom, right? It's a lot of waiting to hear from people from the outside, waiting to know what's going to happen to you next. They're in this strange space of internment. So, similar to the Ginger Rogers anecdote there, the internees also wrote letters. Communication has been identified as a key to good morale in any context, and while letters were censored in wartime, they were used by internees to stay connected with the outside world. They were used to appeal to friends and family, as well as refugee agencies too, for aid and assistance in gaining their release. Again, because it's known that these men, or like a lot of these men, are not here as, you know, actual enemy aliens, they can apply for help from different relief agencies. So this is where our story really begins, because on September 28th, 1940, the Musketeers, Fred, Jerry, and Ernst, wrote their first letter to Winifred Winky Henson, the 16-year-old daughter of Corporal Henson. As Henson would later testify in court, the way that this correspondence started was that Guter said that he was a student of the University of Southampton. I told him that I had a daughter who graduated from high school and was considering continuing studies at McGill night classes. He said he had some textbooks that might help her and also notes of his studies. I then showed him a picture of my daughter, and that was the time when the internees expressed a desire to know her. So the request to write letters came from there. Pictured here is the first letter that they sent to Winky. In the collection that I was working with, there are several drafts of this particular letter, and so it seems that they were agonizing over how exactly to write to her. And so they just introduce themselves. They say, you know, we met your dad in the boiler house, we're taking good care of him. They say later on in it that she could come and walk by the camp if she'd like to say hi to them. And then they receive a response from her a few days later, along with a package of cigarettes. And while at Camp L, they send 4 sets of letters to Winky, and she responds in kind each time. There's a picture of Winky. This is the view that they got. On October 15th, 1940, the Musketeers and 615 other men from Camp L moved to a permanent detention facility just outside of Sherbrooke, Quebec. So this was known as Camp N. It was an old railway yard that had been rejected by the Sherbrooke Fusiliers for their headquarters due to the lack of sanitation and plumbing. Perfect. And as Fred described it in a letter to Winky, now to the new camp. Ooh, what a place. We got there on Tuesday afternoon and it was raining like hell. Ooh, sorry. No sooner out of the train than we were headed into one of 3 disused engine repair sheds. It was really terrible. Dust inches thick, repair pits and rails scattered all over the floor, no water, no light, and inadequate heating. It was a shock, which the self-discipline of 600 internees could not stand. A very light search was made for machine guns and similar weapons, which we might have smuggled through previous camps, and this was the prelude to an impromptu medical examination, which entailed stripping to the waist and sticking one's tongue out underneath a 2,000-watt lamp, saying "ah" and stretching our arms above the head. The reward was a little disc number 222. Cute, isn't it? So, not a great start to this new camp. I'll show you right here, down to Sherbrooke. Some internees actually went on a hunger strike in protest and remained on strike until beds were brought in for them. There are a lot of delays in supplies in wartime, and reading through the war diaries of the camp, you can see the personnel desperately trying to get everything organized to accommodate this group of 600 plus men who have just arrived. At the same time, Corporal Henson, Barney, was transferred back to Montreal, and so the Musketeers now lose their friend in the boiler house, as well as their original male contact to Winky. So in the new boiler house at Camp N, they meet Private James W. Hall, also of the BGC, who now starts distributing the letters for them. So through the letters to Winky, the Musketeers are able to carve out a sense of normalcy for themselves. Winky would write about her work, her social life, and her hobbies. She complained to Ernst about her annoying new coworker, this girl from Toronto who would not shut up about how great Toronto was in Montreal. She asked Jerry about his education at Cambridge and told Fred about her first experience drinking whiskey at an office party. She did not like it. The Musketeers would write back about internment, but also their own interests in music, theatre, education, sport, and world events. One thing that carries through for all of them is that they just can't stand today's music in the 1940s and only like opera. So life carried on even under the strange circumstances of wartime. This is exemplified in a letter from Winky, written on October 28th, 1940. So speaking of dancing, I wish I could get you out of the camp for next Saturday night. It's quite an important night for me. I graduate and receive my diplomas, and then we have a dance after. I'm badly in need of an escort, and all the boys I know are away in the army and don't get leave until Christmas. Well, I guess I'll have to invite one of my beloved brothers if I go. And so the experience of internment was a backdrop to their conversations, but not always at the center of it, and also, I guess in this case, an impediment to their lives. So over the next few weeks and months of correspondence, romance also bloomed between Winky and Fred. The letters made for sometimes awkward flirtation, broken up by gaps of a few days or weeks, where one letter would get to a person first, they would try to respond. People are missing, the connections that are happening there. It's very, very like sweet stuff. Winky has a hand-drawn sketch of Fred, the one that you've been seeing in this presentation, that she has up in her bedroom on the wall, and she gets teased for it by her family. Fred keeps a photo, this photo, of Winky in a silver frame in his locker in the camp. Winky then starts referring to Fred as her Galahad, and begins telling the girls at work that he is her boyfriend whenever she gets mail from him. So on November 12th, 1940, Jerry was transferred out of Camp N. So this is one of our musketeers is split from the group. His departure was viewed as a sign of impending release. At the same time, Winky was warned by her parents not to write so frequently, as the letters risked looking suspicious to authorities, who might wonder how she had met the musketeers. In a quote from her letter on November 15th, written to Fred, "I hope you understand that my mother and father are doing this in my interests and not to be spiteful. Anyway, I am keeping you in mind constantly and hope you won't forget me. Love, Winks." The warning also from her parents did not deter Winky. Instead of slowing her letters, she asked Fred to send them to her office, where she worked as a stenographer for the felt manufacturer E.F. Walter, instead of her family home. So there's an example of one of these now rerouted letters. So she's going circumventing restrictions yet again in order to get her letters to her friends. So, just after Christmas, on December 27th, Fred writes a letter to Winky describing his intentions after internment. And I'll just plug this for a second. This is an illustration I did for this presentation as well. So that's my depiction of Fred writing. So 3 months of corresponding with you has made me not only admire your style and charm, but also given me a desire to meet you. Already I am planning to stay in Canada, or at least return as soon as I am naturalized. You must appreciate that I am by no means a fool, despite the fact that my customary flippancy includes one to that belief. I am quite capable of serious thought. Canada, to me, presents enormous scope in the industrial field, and though the time to achieve is now, I am quite aware that Canada's development after the war is already a foregone conclusion. For one as ambitious as I, coupled with my technical knowledge of production, there will be much scope in this new world. In the meantime, I must concentrate on 1, helping the empire in its hour of need, and 2, obtaining my naturalization. These are of vital importance to me, and when they are achieved, I can turn my eyes west and look toward the future. But enough of this. A too serious note is likely to frighten you off altogether. As I said in the beginning, the writing of the letters to you has become difficult not because I am at a loss for words, but because I am not sure of the way you will take them. I'd hate to lose your friendship, but nothing ventured, nothing won, and faint heart never won fair lady. So he really puts his heart out there. Shortly after Christmas, Private Hall, who had been passing the letters back and forth, is transferred out of the camp again. And Fred now approaches Private DJ Home from the Canadian Provost Corps in late January to mail more of his letters. At this point in time, he hadn't heard from Winky in over a month. So he's waiting still on that response from that last letter. He gave the soldier 2 letters, one from John Carter, pictured here, a new addition to the Musketeers, their Porthos. John ran a ballet company in London and sent Winky 2 pages devoted to theatre recommendations in Montreal. And another was a short note about New Year's from Fred, which ended with 2 postscripts. P.S. Did you get my letter from the 28th? P.S. 2. If you like, you can write to me officially, so long as you do not mention our illicit correspondence, and treat me as an old friend. One other fellow has a girl in Quebec, and she has no difficulties. There really is no risk. Having received, I guess we'll cut back to him just passing these letters over to this new guard. So having received a lecture on restrictions on internee mail earlier in the week, Private Home took the letters from Fred directly to his commanding officer in the Provost Corps, who then took them to the camp intelligence officer. The internees involved were arrested and then placed in detention. And here as we come to the court-martial. So Corporal Henson and Private Hall were apprehended soon after, and in Montreal, the Henson home was searched by a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. 17 documents were collected for trial, including letters, envelopes, and 2 hand-drawn portraits of the Musketeers. Over 40 documents altogether, and this is coming from the camps as well, made up a body of evidence against Henson and Hall, who again were charged with violating Section 40 of the Army Act, conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. The case saw 17 witnesses in all, including Winky. This was at the Sherbrooke Fusiliers headquarters in Montreal, downtown, right close to the main train station. And both Henson and Hall pleaded guilty. In the end, Henson was sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment, and Hall to 120 days of detention. The internees in the camps each received 28 days of solitary confinement. According to the court-martial committee, at the end of the case, any potential threat to security had been nipped in the bud. And so I have this here. There were reports that came out afterward as well, just in the Canadian press. It doesn't really give you much information on who the guards were, but we know that it's Henson and Hall. But again, at that last line it says, "I hope that this will serve as a lesson for other guards. They must understand that such things are not permissible." So really the stress was on the fact that they broke confidentiality, that they went against the rules, not necessarily that there was anything wrong in the letters, but just that they were breaching military discipline. And so, my epilogue. So in the late 1970s, years after his release from internment, Fred Lysette, then going by Fred Cooter, was interviewed by Eric Koch. So this book, Deemed Suspect, A Wartime Blunder. This book came out in 1980 and comprises of over 90 interviews with former internees. Eric Koch was another internee, but also a CBC reporter and radio announcer. In reporting the experiences of internees, he interviewed Fred. And when asked about the letter episode, and Winky specifically, Fred was dismissive. He did not seem to want to talk about it. Though, interestingly, he did know where Winky lived and worked in Montreal, which he reveals in the interview. So what all of this kind of comes around to is that in wartime, letters offered internees connection with the outside world, an escape from their predicament, both real and imagined. Though through correspondence, many sought to maintain relationships with friends and family, or to appeal to refugee organizations that might assist in securing their release. Writing was, as at its core, a means of establishing a sense of normalcy. Correspondence, when passed through unofficial channels, was also a disruptor. Letters could threaten security of the Canadian home front, at least on paper. In this case, they also fractured a wartime network of friends and potential romance. And now, decades later, they are a window into the shared lives of civilians and internees in wartime Canada, a unique view through which to explore the home front as it was experienced. And what this all really comes down to is thinking about the afterlives of letters then. And this is what my research now looks at. This is kind of all branching from here. I came across this case by browsing through the thousands of court-martial files that are available online through Heritage Canadiana. And so these digital files are made up of the reels of microfilm that were created in the 60s of all of these court-martial cases. The originals have since been destroyed, to my knowledge, and so this is the only kind of record we have left of this set of correspondence, at least on an official level. And so I came across these letters. I was interested in the case, and through my research, I ended up getting in touch with a couple of descendants of these individuals as well. And this is kind of what I'm thinking about with afterlives. So afterlives of letters, not just in how they are experienced in their contemporary context. So, you know, as actual like means of corresponding of conversation between people, or as means of criminalization, but also as ways of connecting family members with the past. I met with Fred's daughter, Elizabeth, and then also with Winky's niece. Winky never married. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes just around the same time her father was released from prison, and thought she wouldn't live long enough to have a family, and so she never pursued anything like that. Fred, as his daughter said, he, after his release from internment around 1943, goes over to England and joins the British Army, and there he meets a German widow and marries her and adopts his children, and has his own daughter, Elizabeth, and comes back and lives in Montreal. But again, according to the interview and according to Elizabeth and even to Winky's niece, they never really discussed this kind of history that was here, that existed. And that's where I think being able to look at these letters is really important, because even if fleeting, the relationship still tells us something important about the Canadian home front and kind of the how interconnected and how fluid these boundaries between internee and civilian, and even soldiers and civilians were at this time. And so I think, again, the value of a case like this is really in those everyday interactions, those very small details that we can pull out from a case that ultimately did not go well for those involved, but because of that, we get to appreciate it today. And so that's the sense of my presentation, but I think a lot more of it will come out through talking to you as individuals as well, which is kind of a hybrid thing. I think the question periods with a talk like this is really valuable in thinking about everyday experiences. So, thank you.
I can start out.
Yes.
So when the internees, when they left England, what happened to their families that were still in England?
So it depends, I guess, on who is there. A lot of the guys who I was looking at with these camps are kind of young and single men or older. So again, yeah, it depends. Like this group, Fred's mother remains in England because she's not like considered part of this these dangerous enemy aliens. Ernst's family, he left behind in Europe because he came there as a Jewish refugee. He came to the UK as a Jewish refugee. But in other instances, there were families that were interned, or like men and women were both interned in the UK as well. And so it just happens that this group was sent over largely because they were kind of unattached in this way. But there were whole families, like I mentioned the Isle of Man. They had women's camps there or family camps there as well that some would stay in. So again, it depends on the specific situation. Any other questions? Yes.
An observation and a question. Those penalties seem pretty draconian by today's standards, but in historical context, particularly when you consider the discipline of war in the armed forces, they're probably not that bad. I mean, they used to shoot quite a few people for relatively minor offenses. My question is, can you tell us a little more about the trial? Kind of interested. Did they actually have a trial, or did everyone plead guilty? And if they did have a trial, what materials were you able to access with respect to the trial?
So wonderful question. I think, yeah, your point about the degree of punishment, I was trying to find other cases that involved kind of like these illicit correspondences. There's only one other I found with involving a Veterans Guard member, and he does not receive the same kind of punishment for what happens. I think because in this case it's early on in the war, and they really want to like make an example. That's why that 1 year sentence. But in other cases, like the sentences vary. I mean, they only go to a court martial because the potential punishment is more than 28 days in detention, and so that's where usually they'll try and keep things out of the court martial trials, just because that is such a kind of ordeal. It requires a lot of resources to go into it. And then your other question was about just like how that court martial functions. And so they gather a committee of about 3 or 4 members who come in. It depends on the circumstances. In this case, the trials of Henson and Hall took place on the same day in Montreal, so they would have to bring everyone in, but they did have witnesses come in person. And you could plead not guilty, because there are instances of that as well, and some people were let off. It's one thing I'm interested in. This is like a tangent about the Veterans Guard, in that there's sometimes, it seems like not that they get off easy, but they'll often appeal to the courts by talking about their First World War service when they make a mistake, or when something goes awry, and saying like, well, yes, I know I breached discipline here, but I do have a good track record. So if you could, like look beyond this, maybe we can kind of lessen the sentencing there. But it does occur very much the same as a civilian court like trial would take place, just with sometimes a lot less training on the part of those running it. They would try and bring in people with legal experience when they could, but that's not always possible, especially in field court martials. And so sometimes things are a little more haphazard. But when they're on the home front, it's easier to get things organized for the case. Like the defense for Henson was a lawyer trained in Montreal, and so they were lucky in this case. but that's not always how it works. There's a military like legal handbook that all the officers receive who are involved in these cases, and again, some are better than others. Hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Yes.
So following up on that, what happened to the two soldiers? Were they, after they served their term, did they go back into the army, or were they dismissed?
So great question. So Henson goes, he does return to the Veterans Guard, and he continues on with his like guard duties. He actually dies in 1947, so not long after the end of the war. I don't have the details on the circumstances of his death. I'm actually waiting on his personnel file to come through Library and Archives Canada to kind of get more of that information. But I do know that he's later like commended for his like kind of good work in transporting prisoners. With Private Hall, there's a letter included in this court case where closer to the end of the war, he asks for it to be stricken from his record because he feels that it's not representative of his like patriotism to Canada. And he says, if you can't take it off of my record, like I want to be dismissed from the army because like this is so shameful to me to have this like disciplinary action taken against me. And so they did continue to serve, but to different degrees and with different feelings about the case as it like kind of unfolded.
If you don't mind,
Yeah.
two comments. My grandfather on my father's side was German, and he was in the Isle of Man in the First World War. Even though he was quite a person in the village in England that he lived in. He lived there from about 1890 onward. The second one was, I was fortunate enough to look after Beauty Creek Youth Hostel in Jasper, up in Columbia Icefields, in I think 1974. And we were told by the wardens that the three buildings had internees staying in the building. Mm-hmm. They were moved from some other place and brought to this location. There was no insulation or anything. They were just wooden structures, and they were, I can honestly tell you that in October when I left, they were colder than hell. And very, very cold, and we'd get the fire in the stove going, it would be glowing red, and there'd be 5 or 10 people in chairs all around us,
just all huddled
bags all night long trying to stay warm.
Yeah, like
So
yeah,
imagine
the conditions. I mean, you see it both in complaints like from internees or them speaking about their experiences, but also in morale reports from the Veterans Guard. These are kind of started by the Department of Defense in 1943 onwards, where they're collecting surveys, just getting a sense of how things are going. And a lot of the complaints are about the accommodations, especially as these camps, because I'm looking at civilian internees here, but they do transition to being almost entirely prisoners of war, like enemy merchant, like seamen as well. And because of the Geneva Convention, there are certain standards that must be met for their living conditions, though not always met as well as you'd hope. But oftentimes the Veterans Guard would complain that the prisoners were being treated better than they were, and saying, I think there's also like there's an age difference for them as well. Like they're often dealing with different kind of health conditions as opposed to the younger internees. But yeah, for the most part, like these places are not designed to house adults long term as they did. Either they're kind of like made like ad hoc for these circumstances, or they're just reusing old buildings, just like the railway sheds. There's one nearby that's like an old boys' reformatory that is like converted into camps. And I've heard stories about what happens to them afterward. So it's cool that you got to see some of those as they existed. I know there's one at least that was used then for like Boy Scouts campgrounds as well, and so they become different things after the war too. But yeah, quality not great.
You've obviously done a great deal of research Where did you go to do your primary research? Did you go to England?
Thank you for the question, wonderful. So the initial look at these primary sources, the court documents, I was able to do online. But then I went to Library and Archives Canada, in Ottawa, to go look at the war diaries for the camps. This is one thing that a lot of things have been digitized through the Library and Archives Canada, but not the internment camp files for the most part. And so I had to go there to look through the big books. I didn't go to England for this case specifically. I had thought about going and traveling there to visit the Isle of Man specifically. I know they have a really good museum and archives there that would be wonderful to see, as well as get a sense of who these people were before they came to Canada. But for the purposes of this, I was kind of thinking about where they went afterward, how they kind of branched out from this camp. I guess, I'll amend that slightly. I was on a research trip in London, England. I ended up going to the British Archives there, and I did look at some documents, some cases. It's how I found out more about John Carger, who is that fourth musketeer who's added on later, because he's a later arrival and spends a lot longer time in England than the rest of them. He's actually from he's from the Isle of Man originally, and then ends up going to different places in Europe before being interned. And so there is an instance of looking at British records. This is a lot going on. So that's hopefully answers your question. Yes.
It's interesting that Winky's family, apart from admonishing her not to write too often, seem to tolerate this behavior pretty well. Was there not any kind of backlash in the military because he was permitting his daughter to fraternize with the enemy? I mean, I appreciate that some of this took place relatively early in the war, but you watch documentaries on the Second World War, and there seemed to be a pretty strong hatred for the enemy, and that seemed to go both ways. So I'm just wondering whether you found that in your research.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, yes, they tease her. I mean, her dad is pretty okay with her sending these letters because it's he knows these guys. He says, well, in the trial transcript, he says I said I was going to check over the letters to make sure there's nothing illegal or bad in them. So I thought I'd make sure everything's above board. I think it helps in this case that they know that there are people who are not Nazis in these camps. It's not all enemies. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time in this instance. These are also they're young men who have, for the most part, British accents. They don't come across as the dangerous Germans. There are a lot of Cambridge University students in these. They're a bit more well-to-do as well, and so they're well-traveled. They can kind of talk the talk as well. But that isn't to say that people were not being drawn to the German POWs when they're in Canada as well. There are a few different newspaper reports I've seen, which I still have to corroborate with other records, of girls, specifically teenage girls, passing letters through the barbed wire fence, giving cameras and gifts to things to these young German POWs who are in these remote communities in Northern Ontario and Quebec, because I mean, as Winky points out about her dance, there's a lack of young men around, and so suddenly there are a bunch of them all dropped right nearby. It's hard not to be curious about them at the very least, and so people would even just drive around to go look at them in the internment camps. There are cases of this too in the States where. It feels very sensationalized, but it is, again, it's all these young men in their 20s, and they're all out there playing sports in the sun, and so the Americans who are all living in the towns nearby, will drive to the edges of the camp to watch them. So I think there's a fascination with them as the enemy, especially when you're on the home front. The war is present, but it's also removed, and so you can forget about certain aspects of it if you haven't been kind of in it in that way. So I hope that answers your question. Anything else? Yes.
How many of the internees were repatriated and actually went back and served?
I don't have a specific number for you, but there is a whole scheme where a lot of internees could kind of get, I'm going to say like early access to release, but there was a specific like unit within the British military for these returned internees, because that's what Fred actually joined up with them to serve, and so there was this whole kind of subgroup within the internees who really wanted to return to England to serve for the country that they belonged to, and so yeah, there's I'm sorry I don't have a specific number for you, but there is a good portion of that, and even beyond serving in the military, a lot of them actually do come back to Canada after the war, and there's a Maclean's article from the 60s with like hundreds of names of these men who are all now kind of in Canadian in society. A lot work for the CBC. That's a fun fact about internment. But they're very like involved in Canadian cultural growth in the post-war era, and a lot of them credit their time in internment as a way of kind of getting the door open for them.
They didn't have any bitterness towards being interned?
It's like a weird situation. I think this group of internees specifically is unique in that a lot of them, or there's a good portion of them that are Jewish refugees coming from mainland Europe, and so what they left behind is not as welcoming. Not that Canada was perfect, there was a lot of cases of anti-Semitism in these camps as well, but it gave them a kind of a taste of a different life that they may not have considered before, and especially as young men, when they were young men coming into the camps, it's like this like bonding experience. Like you spend a couple of years of your life in the middle of like nowhere or in a camp with kind of your peers, all experiencing the same difficulties, but making the best of it as you can. So you kind of develop these positive memories even in that strange, confined situation. And so, yeah, they have a weird relationship with internment, I guess is a kind of general way of saying it, and again, much different from other interned groups. I think they're a special case. Yes.
Do you have any information why they wouldn't intern these men on a military base?
So
just lack of space, or
it really was like resources.
Barracks were our actual military.
Yes, so they're trying to like balance wartime resources, and they hadn't kind of anticipated the needs of these men during wartime. I mean, it's another reason why they're bringing in so many and looking for so many veterans guardsmen as well. They're trying to send the young men overseas to fight and gathering up resources at home. But yeah, for the most part, if they have usable military barracks, they're going to want to use them for the active forces.
Yeah.
That being said, there is an internment camp at Petawawa, but it's largely for Italian internees. But there is a case of where it's kind of serving at that dual purpose of being a training base, but also an internment camp. But it depends on the situation.
Just sending them off to freezing, decrepit buildings seems kind of
Yeah.
fair, but then I have to remember the times. Yes, the times.
It's not great. It's not great for anyone, but it is notable, right? Like when you read the accounts of these places, especially for those. I mean, perhaps there's bias on the part of the internees. As I mentioned, like a lot of them from Cambridge. There's a big cohort of them from Cambridge University, and so they're coming from a much different space than what they arrived to in Canada, and so their kind of accounts of it may be colored by that as well. Yes.
My family told me about some of the events that took place. My grandfather was one of the volunteer
Oh, really?
guards, and he was a sergeant, staff sergeant, and the story goes that he would escort a German, usually a German officer who's interned, from up north to Bougainville, and he would be interrogated there. And then when they left, it was usually on a Sunday. And they would go to my grandmother's place on Annette Street and have dinner before they took them back.
It's that sort of thing that comes up, right? Like they develop. It's like they have these kind of interesting relationships with the prisoners. I mean, fascinating because I've seen cases where I've looked at quite a few court-martial cases involving veterans guardsmen, and yeah, there are cases where they've taken some prisoners out to the bar, but they got into a fight and that's how they get caught. But it was like a regular occurrence, right? Like there's a lot of like kind of leniency that happens because they're spending all this time with them. It's something I've wondered too about, like, because they have this shared, military background, if that's something that kind of bonds them together. Like it's people who understand what war can be like, even if you have very vastly different ideological backgrounds, or even not. Like I think thinking about it as a much blurrier, much fuzzier kind of space because of the shared experiences.
My dad he signed up in '44 in the Navy. Mm-hmm. And he was, after going through Toronto here and getting trained, he got shipped to Halifax. And he tells me that the Japanese across Canada, eastern Canada, were rounded up and interned, and they went to a ship in Halifax, and they were shipped to Vancouver, and he went on that ship. And they were interned in BC. Mm-hmm. Did you have any investigation in that or any hearings of that? I haven't kind of gone into looking at Japanese internment to the same extent as I've looked at these cases. Not because I don't think that I think there's a lot of like great comparisons that can be made in these experiences, but it's also a different situation because with Japanese internment, it's kind of complete. It's also dealing with Canadians, Japanese Canadians, rather than kind of these people being brought in from outside of the country to be interned in Canada. And there's also whole families versus, these like kind of little male only camps that end up happening with Germans and Italians. But it's something that I'm curious about, like are the same kind of incidents happening? Especially because there are, again, whole families here, right? There's a lot of different demographics that are involved in these camps. Do the same kind of cross barbed wire interactions happen with the general populations? But it's similar, but also quite different. I think I'd be interested to know again about the experiences of, because I've been thinking about Winky, right? Like these kind of young women who are involved in the camps and how their experiences look on both sides of the barbed wire in these cases. But I think it's a good avenue to look into. Yes.
I'm aware that in England during the war, Germans who were interned, who did not pose a risk, were allowed to go and serve on farms and so on. Did that happen here, or were they constrained within the parameters of the internment camp?
So it's a great point about the labor projects, and yes, they did actually do that in Canada as well. A lot of them were. I think of them concentrated in Northern Ontario. A lot of them were working at lumber camps, but farming as well is one of the kind of projects they do, like infrastructure projects too. This is a carryover as well from the First World War. For example, when Ukrainian Canadians were interned at that time, a lot of them were used in public works projects, and so it's a kind of common theme that goes throughout. And it's another instance of where prisoners could interact with the general population for better or for worse, right? And so I think that's another point of kind of that fluid boundary that these camps have.
I think that's it. Well, thank you again, Gillian. That was a wonderful talk. Some incredible research you've done, and I'm sure you want to get over to England and do as much research
it would be awesome.
as possible. So we have one more talk in our military lecture series, and next month, on April 16th, it actually ties in a little bit with this, with the father of Winky was a home child, and so next month Kelly Morrison is going to talk on lives in servitude and service of British home children and the making of wartime Canada. So it'll be another time.
She's a great speaker. She's a great speaker.
Yeah.
So.
So looking forward to that. So that she'll be the last one of our series for the year, and then we'll start up again in September.
Perfect.
And so thanks so much for coming in tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, as well.